All right. Thomas, can you believe that we're at episode 15 of the SumerSports show? Welcome to all of our listeners here. I'm Eric Eager. I'm the VP of Research and Development at SumerSports. I'm joined by the CEO of SumerSports, Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, how was Christmas? How was all your travels and all that good stuff?
Everything was great. Had a great time in Colorado. Really happy to be back in Atlanta. Christmas in Dixie. There's a song out there, a country song. There's something about being here in the South that's pretty inviting, although it's really cold here right now. So, yeah, I can't wait. You've been ripping it up with these episodes, man. Keep them rolling.
Yeah, I've been, we've gotten so much really good feedback. In fact, I think people, have just like gone out of their way in Twitter DMs and emails and even text messages from friends in the league. So it's been great. And I think that this, genre that we've been doing on Mondays, which has been player evaluation at different positions, has been especially edifying for us. I'm, this is one, Thomas, when I'm like extremely excited because I want to get your opinion. For people that don't know, if this is the first time you've listened to the show, like I ran research and development at Pro Football Focus, at PFF. Like we had people that were charting and grading linebackers, sort of on every single snap. I'll get into that in a second, but like, as you could probably, imagine, I've been a little bit critical of the grades that PFF has because I know sort of where the bodies are buried. And then, obviously Thomas was the general manager of the Atlanta Falcons for 12 years, two-time executive of the year. Prior to that was with the Patriots and, my favorite team, the Detroit Lions, took one on the chin this week. But they he was with them for a while, Cleveland as well. And has had, obviously linebacker evaluations through and through. And even players now, first team All-Pro Devondre Campbell last year was Thomas's draft pick back in 2016 with the Falcons. So I just am so excited here because the depth of my knowledge at linebacker, I think, is limited by my approach to the game, which is very analytical. And yours has obviously had success at the NFL level. So that's kind of where I'm excited about. The other thing I'm excited about, Thomas, is the fact that the position has so many tentacles to it. And that's kind of where I want to start, right? Because, when you were starting in the NFL, there were the 3-4s and there were the 4-3s, but there were also like a lot more variation in the positions that folks were playing, right? Like there was the kind of Sam linebacker that would line up over the tight end in early downs and was kind of, had one role. There was the Will linebacker that kind of was allowed to roam free, and that player was a star. For example, in the Tampa Bay defense with Derek Brooks, and even the those cover two defenses where you had Lance Briggs and guys like that, and then you had the middle linebacker, the Mike guy, who was kind of the bigger guy, the guy that was patrolling the defense and also calling the plays. And as we've moved, and we talked about this in the league, as the league has trended more towards a nickel league, I think the roles of those two linebackers now on base downs have become more interchangeable. But I want to get your opinion on kind of like what you're looking at, because they're not all the same position off ball linebacker, but there is some variation. But has that variation shrunk in recent years?
It's funny. I look back to those years when I was with the Patriots, when we were running that strong 3-4, and we were evaluating certain positions, within that defense. And we were really, really particular about how we evaluated them, what Bill wanted, which is something I've said all along, right? You have to know your scheme. You have to have seminars with your personnel and coaching staffs together, I believe, to make sure everyone truly understands, the type of defense you're going to run and the type of players that you're looking for those positions. Now, remember, a little aside, a lot of coaches have these really, really strict ideas about what they want in that linebacker. And, ideals are one thing. The fact that you can actually get ideal measurements, ideal brain, ideal key and diagnosability. There's so many levels that it's pretty darn tough to put it all together and get the perfect linebacker. So I just wanted to lead in on that for sure. As it pertains to the changing of schemes over the years. I mean, look, I had an opportunity again to be with Bill Belichick in that way. We got to Atlanta. Eric, I was with Mike Smith, who was a former D coordinator, along with Brian Van Gorder. Then we moved from Brian Van Gorder as a defensive coordinator to Mike Nolan, who had a completely different approach and scheme, to Dan Quinn when we hired him in a wildly different scheme, right? all about athletes, all about explosiveness. So I've dabbled in a lot of different schemes, and I think we can get into that as we're talking. But you have a very valid point there. Things have changed drastically. We no longer need a guy inside who's going to be 255 or 60 pounds. Those guys don't even make it. I made mention, we'll talk a little bit about it today, between the true will linebacker in today's league and, the Mike backer, and what you're expecting from these players, versus what they were a few years ago.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even in your time in Atlanta, right? Like the early part, as you said, with like Mike Smith, I mean, you were working with guys like Curtis Lofton and players who were much bigger players who were more physical. And, by the time you got to 2016, like kind of let's be honest, like the 15 and 16 years were your Super Bowl building drafts. And, you went with Deion Jones, a smaller player out of LSU, and Devondre Campbell out of Minnesota as well. Now, Campbell's a bigger guy, but he's still an athlete, right? And you could tell kind of as that season was progressing in 16, where your defense was, early on in the season, it had struggled a little bit. And then by the end of the year, you were flying around getting turnovers and getting touchdowns and really being that team that, ultimately won the NFC that year. And that changed. And I also think so. The other part that I'll bring it back to, and this is kind of where I want to get to our discussion of evaluation, because an off-ball linebacker has three chores, right? They have pass rushing, they have run defense, and they have coverage, right? And depending upon the defense that you run, that distribution is going to change a lot, right? In Dan Quinn's cover 3 in Seattle, right? They had Bruce Irvin kind of being like that Sam backer, and early downs in the 4-3, he's going to rush the passer quite a bit. Mike Zimmer had, Anthony Barr kind of playing that position early downs. And he, again, was a guy, we were talking about a 20% pressure rate from him on early downs when they actually got to play the 4-3. And then, but as the league evolved, you saw more 4-2-5 out of, for example, Zimmer's defense. You saw more 4-2-5 out of the Seattle defense, and they had to either take Irvin off the field altogether, or they had to play him at rush end. And when you're playing a linebacker at rush end, obviously, for a lot of the questions that we've had, for example, this is a really good one from Mojal here. Basically, do you even need linebackers in the modern era? Why not use defensive backs? Like, there are different body types for those different positions. And there was always the question, you even saw it in free agency. Anthony Barr initially left Minnesota to go play 3-4 outside linebackers so he could rush the passer more and make more money. But ultimately, he had cold feet and went back to Minnesota and played off ball because, again, that was sort of more his skill set. Like, I don't know if the average fan really does appreciate kind of those three prongs of what it takes to be a linebacker in today's NFL, and why you can't just take a guy, like Anthony Barr, 6'4", 230, 240, and he can't just play defensive end in the 3, or outside linebacker, sorry, in the 3-4, or take Deion Buchanan, who is a first-round pick in 2014 by the Cardinals, as a safety out of Washington State. They try his hand at inside linebacker, and everybody wrote all these articles about how this was the new age linebacker. And ultimately, when you went and watched film, he was getting wiped out all the time in the run game, right? So, there are like an appreciation of those three things for a linebacker. Thomas, which one of those is the hardest to evaluate when you're looking at a guy coming out? And B, obviously, which is the most important when you're trying to look for a linebacker in the modern scheme?
Well, there's so much there. You teed me up on a lot. Let me start by saying you can make or break a linebacker that you have brought in mainly through the draft. Of course, you can also do it in free agency through your coaching staff. And I say that with massive respect to a coaching staff. This is why it is vital that you're communicating with your personnel department and your coaching staff to make sure you know exactly what you're looking for and what's required within their specific schemes. And I say that because, look, to your point right now, the most difficult thing, I would say too, before I get into this, the most difficult position, one of the most difficult positions in this league to evaluate are the off-ball linebacker, because there's so much involved. And then you fold in scheme nuances that can take a guy that looked really good at Notre Dame or Southern Cal or, South Carolina, and you put him in your scheme as an NFL team. And all of a sudden, you're all sitting there in meeting rooms going, what did we miss on this guy? The most difficult area to truly evaluate, not only from an athletic standpoint, but also how they are going to relate to the scheme and what they're expected to do in the new pro scheme that they're going to be in is pass coverage. It is not easy at all. You can sit there and look, we do that. Exactly what you said. Three-pronged approach. We evaluate versus a run. We evaluate versus a pass. And within the pass, of course, it's in coverage. And, of course, it's getting the hell upfield, trying to rattle that quarterback. Those are really, really important parts, of course, but they're not easy to evaluate, especially on the coverage side, Eric.
Well, and that's exactly what I think, because as somebody who kind of, I've looked at the pro, I've worked for Pro Football Focus, I worked for them from 2015 to 2022. And you take a player like Deion Jones, the guy you drafted, right? Like, his data at LSU didn't look particularly good. I think when you drafted him in the second round, I don't know if, the Steve Palazzolos and the Sam Monsons who worked for us at the time, like, gave you a great grade for that one. But I'm going to be honest, like, I think when it comes to stopping the run, I think like per play grading and I think production does a really good job of denoting who's good. Like if you look at run stop percentage, it's pretty stable year to year. If you look at pass rushing, it's pretty stable, percentages year to year. It's the coverage stuff. And I think the real issue with the coverage stuff is the fact that all these defenses, I think, have what I call a fall guy, right? So I look at like Tampa Bay's Super Bowl winning defense, and I'm looking at Carlton Davis, and I'm looking at Jamel Dean on the outside, Sean Murphy-Bunting inside, the two safeties with Whitehead and Antoine Winfield Jr. And those guys are doing their job, right? They're doing their job. And the best outcome for an offense is to dump the ball to the running back and have him be the best outcome for a defense is for the offense to dump the ball underneath and have Devin White, the 5th overall pick out of LSU, be one-on-one with the running back, right? And his grade per Pro Football Focus or per the metrics, if you look at like yards into his coverage or whatever, is going to depend upon whether or not he can make that tackle in space, right? But for the most part, if you miss a tackle in space on a running back and it turns from a 4-yard gain to a 7-yard gain, he might get a bad grade. But from the perspective of a defense, it's perfectly fine, right? You'd rather have the offense dump the ball to the running back and him be one-on-one with an athlete like that than to throw against your corners or throw against your safeties in coverage, right? And so all these guys in this defense get a good grade. And then the linebacker gets all the crappy grades because, you're funneling plays to him. He's the fall guy of a defense. And I look at like a guy like Jones is a very similar one where, he just got a lot of coverage statistics at LSU because they were throwing at him. And they were throwing at him because there was no one else to throw to on that defense. And he gets a poor grade. Now, he goes to Atlanta, and you can immediately see, like, okay, he's got range. He can cover the middle part of the field. He can blitz, obviously, really well. And against the run, he's a little smaller, but that's okay, generally speaking, because you want to give up some, in the NFL, you'd rather give up run than you'd rather give up pass. But to me, I agree with your point. Like coverage is so hard to evaluate from my perspective as an analytics guy. What are you looking at from a scout's perspective? What traits are you looking for with respect to his coverage ability? Because I think that that's kind of where somebody like me could see a guy and not really like his data. And then somebody like you could come through and kind of correct me on sort of where the guy is from that perspective.
No, when you presented me with the data on this in our early report, I was thinking, man, this would be great. Again, back to augmenting what my abilities are, right? I would love to do that. Going into another time, another place. Again, you as my assistant GM, I'm of course, I always do that little pump there. I was thinking about that idea. So as far as evaluating the ability to cover as a linebacker, and remember, by the way, when we drafted Deion Jones, we drafted him at 222. In those years, and I know I mentioned this in another pod, his butt got down to we had him at 211 at times, which was way counterintuitive to me. I'm thinking because of the run side, right? So it was a catch-22. We had him out there on the flank doing a hell of a job covering Alvin Kamara, who I thought in his heyday was one of the very best out there. And he's still rocking some big games, of course, when he's healthy. We talked about that up and down within our staff meetings. We need someone that can run with these either, could be the running backs, of course, but it could also be a tight end. Someone has a little bit bigger element to him, but can also move. When you're talking about coverage for a linebacker in the NFL, I'm talking about the ability. It starts with athleticism. It starts with fluidity and fluidity in the hips, the ability to jam your foot into the ground and accelerate out of your cuts. Again, maneuverability, versatility, the idea, and I know you'll bring this up, the idea that they have vision, the idea that they have anticipation to break on the ball. So their break on the ball is really, really important. But it's not just athleticism. It's the mind and the awareness and the anticipation that they have that we factor in. Now, there's also these guys that look really good running. They cover a lot of ground. Devondre Campbell's a different guy, and I'll talk about him in a minute. Hopefully you bring it back around to him. But let's stay on the Deion Jones type or the other linebackers who were the true athletic cover guys. The only problem there are times that guys look good. They can run. They've timed well at the combine, all of this. But the awareness when the ball is in the air, they lose it. And that's not only linebackers, believe me. I could go on and on. You know my love about evaluating the secondary. It's one of my biggest pet peeves. When you have a guy that looks pretty and they lull you a little bit and they feign that they're good because they're right on the hip in phase, but they don't finish the play. That is a big thing to make sure that a guy, can finish the play as a linebacker as well. Bringing this right around to the very end and back to you. You can have all of these athletic talents, but if you get in a scheme that is not comfortable to you, and sometimes it makes you think too much, and you take away what is your strength and anticipation, but you're thinking about 1, 2, 3, X, Y, and Z. You're mixing it all up, and you have a coach in your ear saying you need to do this. It's complicated. The NFL is not easy, and the intelligence in the league with the offensive schemes make these positions really, really complicated in my mind to evaluate and to hit on. If you hit them in the right situation and you school these guys right and you give them the opportunity to grow and learn within your new scheme, then you have a fighting chance. If not, it can be a tough road.
Yeah, and it's so hard because I think for most coverage players, it's a lot like soccer. Like if you have to make a slide tackle on a player, you were out of position already, right? But I think like for a lot of other positions, like linebackers, sometimes you are designed to be the person targeted. And I think for corners, like if a guy isn't giving up a ton of separation at corner, but he's giving up plays, like I'll generally speaking buy into that player because I think contested catches are kind of noisy, and especially when it's a wide receiver, like that player's paid to make contested plays. But if you're a linebacker and running backs are making contested catches on you, or tight ends to a lesser extent are making contested catches on you, I feel like that's not great. Like I think that you have to be able to break those plays up because the guy you're going up against on offense is not as talented, when the ball's in the air. So to your point, like there's a reason why not that many running backs split out and play in the slot, because they don't have that ability. And if you're a linebacker, like you sort of have to be able to make that play when you're in that position. Plus, you are supposed to be a more physical player than a corner or a safety is. So I do think that is one place where if I look at coverage statistics, I'm going to be a little disappointed if he's giving up contested plays. But it's just a hard position to your point, because a guy like Fred Warner, he's going to be so rangy that he's going to prevent middle of the field plays. You look at like some of the pass charts and stuff when he plays linebacker for the Niners, like they're just not throwing middle of the field. And then you're going to look at other defenses where they have to throw middle of the field because they're, like Seattle, for example, when Wagner was there and plays like that, where Wagner's making a ton of plays because he's not only getting a lot of targets thrown to him, but he's also preventing those targets from being either catches or yards when it happens. I want to take one more look at coverage from a different perspective. And this is one where I want to kind of show how you can marry the analytics with the traditional scouting in a way that I think is fruitful, right? So when I'm looking at like analytics, I'm looking at, for example, taking something that you're saying, which is what I call like reaction time. Like how good is his instinct? How good are his instincts? And I'm going to try to use the tracking data to kind of measure that. So one thing that myself and my group, when I was at PFF, we did was we took the tracking data and looked and said, okay, when a team runs the football, how much ground does the linebacker cover between him and the running back? How much does that shrink in the first 2 seconds of the play? So basically you hand the ball off and how much closer does he get? And that deals with reaction time. So is he messing around with guard, if the guard pulls a different way and they run a counter play on him or something, or, just like, does he follow the eye candy of a reverse fake or a jet sweep fake? All that stuff. Does he close ground on the running back in the first 2 seconds of the play. I'm calling that. And then what I do is adjust that for down and distance. So as you know, like on, let's say 1st and 10, it's much more likely a rundown. So I'm going to expect you to react to a run more quickly than like a 3rd down where they run a surprise run play. I'm going to expect you to react to the run more slowly. So I'm calling that, and that you create an expectation. You call that ground covered over expected. So guys who do that better flow to the run better than guys who don't do that very well. And then I have a different thing because, as you know, Thomas, and this is becoming increasingly popular in the NFL, teams run play action to get linebackers out of position. The middle of the field is the most valuable place in football. That's why we all care about linebackers, because they're covering the most valuable position in football. I'm measuring how much they bite on play action vertically, right? So how much closer are they to the line of scrimmage because a team's running play action? And I adjust that for things like down and distance, right? So if you bite on play action on 1st down, I'm not going to ding you as much as if you bite on play action on 3rd down when it's a passing down, right? And what you would expect, Thomas, is the guys that flow to the run really quickly, they bite on play action more. And guys that bite on play action less, they're not as aggressive against the run. So you would expect this sort of trade-off. And what I found, which is really fun, and I'm going to add this to the stream here, is that there is actually this relationship between how much ground you cover in the run game. So if you're looking here at the x-axis, basically left to right, and how much you bite on play action. So there is a relationship here. Now, what's really cool, Thomas, is you see like characteristics here. Like Zach Cunningham in the lower right-hand part of the screen is a guy that really does flow well against the run, but he does bite a ton on play action. That's why he's in the lower right. If you look at Devin White, Levante David, Bobby Okirike, Darius Leonard, guys like that, they do a really good job of not biting on play action, but they're a little slower to flow against the run. At least in 2021 they were. A guy like Alex Singleton, he doesn't bite that much on play action, but he does flow pretty well to the run. That's actually a pretty good player right there. Now, one of the Patriots' former linebackers, now he didn't play much last year, that did well in this metric every single year. So he didn't bite on play action, but he also flowed really well against the run. And that was Dante Hightower. So, obviously in your tree with Belichick, that was a player who did really well. Does that make sense as something where, Thomas, you're saying something as a trait, and we go out of our way as analytics people to try to measure that using the GPS data?
No, it makes a ton of sense. And you hit the nail on the head. I don't know how many times we would try to get that guy in who was urgent once the snap, the snap of the ball. We wanted them to react right away and go. We called it, we also called it reactionary athleticism, right? But we talked about go hard, see the ball and go, pin your ears back and go, go, go. And yet how many times we got in that situation where we're pulling our hair out because of the Deion Joneses of the world, who we had a great deal of respect for, just to bring him back into it. He would bust on the ball like that, but the play action pass thing would come into play, of course. So yes, there's no question that this is very valid. I love this. This is, although a little bit messy to the eye, not for someone like you, but a little messy to the eye. I think it can be really beneficial to hand over to the decision makers for sure.
What was really cool was I used this in, when Roquan Smith was going up for a contract extension with the Bears. And, obviously you have all the uncertainty of like, do you want to pay a linebacker $20 million APY? I think we'll get to that in a second. Versus would you trade him for draft capital? And what I went to and I looked at, and again, you look at this figure, and Bobby Okereke and Darius Leonard are kind of right in the same spot. Those are Eberflus linebackers, right? Mm-hmm. And Roquan Smith is not anywhere close to them on this graph. And so you're looking and saying, okay, do you really want to buy into a linebacker in a new scheme when historically guys that have had success in that scheme are in different parts of that graph? And I think from our perspective, with a trained eye like yours, you can say, okay, this guy is an Eberflus linebacker or he's not, or maybe we'll take a season to figure it out. With respect to the Bears, they didn't have that much time, right? Like they were holding on to an asset that could have been worth a lot to them from the perspective of a trade. And so they had to make that decision quickly. And the fact that Smith, who is a very good linebacker, was not necessarily the same type of linebacker that had success in Eberflus's scheme. That's good to be able to denote. And I had a tweet thread about that early on in the season. And, a lot of people were like, well, who cares? Just pay him. Who cares? Just pay him. And it's like, well, that's a lot of money to pay to an off-ball linebacker who might not fit.
Look, I do want to come back to a comment you made earlier about the corner versus the linebacker. You said you had a little more understanding about the corner that was in phase and was right there, may not make the play on the ball. If I heard you correctly, I had a number of situations in the past where I did get caught up because I'm a big athletic guy. Like I love looking and discerning the athleticism because it's a matchup league. As I mentioned, they have to be able to move. If you can't move, if you can't match, you can't play in this league. And yet how many times, Eric, that I had a corner a la Chris Houston, who was with us just before I got to Atlanta. Then he went to Detroit, right? Every time I saw him, man, he looked so pretty, flipping, spinning, doing everything he needed to do. And he was always on a hip, and he just did not consistently make a play. And in the end, even though he looks good, that would come down on us as the selectors of the people or the head coach and the GM. Like, how did you miss on that guy? And it's complicated where you flip it around and you get a guy like AJ Terrell, for instance, who's has done a really good job in Atlanta. Big guy, moves well, but also makes a lot of plays on the ball. That is a big thing. So flip it from cornerback to linebacker. I just want to talk about that again. The same thing happens to us, especially when you're motivated by a man and a coach like Dan Quinn, who, like me, is also a big believer in athleticism, urgency, but a burst on the ball, speed to cover ground, rangy. They look really good at what they're doing, but sometimes, and I've mentioned this in other pods, we get caught up in that a little bit, Eric, because we think there is the potential. We can teach this guy to be better, to finish plays on the ball, to anticipate better, because, coaches believe they can do that. I'm talking position coaches. All of a sudden, you have a stallion there, moves around real well, but he is not finishing. You flip it over to a guy who doesn't look as good, maybe doesn't get drafted as high. And we'll talk about that today when we're talking about our linebackers, right? I think it's really fascinating. There are guys out there who just make plays on the ball, and they may not be as adept moving around as you might think, but in the end, they're doing what they need to do.
Absolutely. And there was a player, actually, I think we want to talk about our wins and losses on this show. In the 2020 draft, I was very high on Deion Taylor out of Colorado, a guy who, there's a number of reasons my model liked him. I mean, he had played a lot. He played a lot extended at Colorado, so meaning that he was out over the slot a lot. He had great coverage statistics out over the slot. He had great athleticism. He had so much going for him, to the point where, I thought he could have even been somewhere close to a first-round pick that year just on athleticism alone. And shout out to a lot of my friends in the league when I try to go through and say, hey, like, what do you guys think of this linebacker? Now the Eagles end up drafting him. He's had a really hard time of it. The Eagles drafted him at what I think a third round, where frankly, like, I think that was probably better off to take a shot at a guy like that. But everybody in the league who talked to me, was just like, look, like, his instincts aren't particularly good. So to your point, Thomas, where like even the math, when you look at the college level, and again, this is like what's so hard about this process, where at the college level, he could move his hips. He could, if he was a step behind because he had bad instincts, he could make it up because he's so much faster than other Pac-12, running backs and tight ends. It shows up okay in my data, but somebody like you watches him and you're like, it's not going to work out in the NFL if he makes similar false steps and he makes similar, mistakes here. And so like, that's another one where I asked one of my friends in the league and they're like, well, Eric, there's not going to work out here unless he learns significant amounts of football. And like what you're saying is like, a lot of times the coaches are overconfident about how much they can teach these players when they get to the NFL. Now, let's circle it back to Campbell, right? Because you took Jones. Jones was kind of your Mike, right? In that scheme. Duke Riley was one of your outside guys, and then you had Devondre as your other guy, and he was your nickel. He was the second linebacker in nickel with Deion. What were his characteristics? Because he's gone on. He had a good career with you in Atlanta, some injuries and stuff like that. He went to Arizona, not much there. And then he goes to Green Bay, all pro last year. Yesterday on Christmas, he had an interception or two. And now I think he was one of like 5 people that have an interception of Tua, but we're still not going to degrade him for that. He had an interception of Tua. He's found a home there. What was his so what was the evaluation of him, a 4th rounder out of Minnesota?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, let's say kudos to Jeff Ulbrich. our linebacker coach, because he was on him from day one. This is where the coaches, at times, even though they've not been on the road like some of the scouts have for months and months, 14 months leading up to the draft, sometimes a fresh eye by a linebacker coach in this situation comes in, starts watching his video on the college guys, and starts thinking there's something special about D. Campbell. So again, kudos to Jeff Albrecht for that, who's now the D coordinator, of course, with the Jets, right? So it's interesting because he was a big, tall drink of water who could move and was really rangy, and he had good athleticism about him. Again, to turn. I always talk about it being body control. His body control for a big man like that could be eye catching at times. Not all the time, but there was something about him. You thought, if we give him even that much more coaching, nothing against the University of Minnesota and their coaching staff, but look, we knew that there was potential there. And, as a staff, we continue to grow thanks to Jeff's insight on it. And we thought we had a really, really good player to build on. And he was still raw in certain ways. Comes in, he does that, right? He grows with us. He ends up being a good linebacker for us. We expected big things. Unfortunately, we did not re-sign him. There are myriad reasons for that, which we won't get into on this pod. And yet he does go other places. This is where I think he can go to other places with different schemes and maybe thrive. And where he is right now, it's fun to watch what he's done over the last couple of years. But again, remember, a guy like Matt LaFleur was around. He knew him when he was at Atlanta, and Matt was at Atlanta. So those things always help. Can I just interject before we go any further here?
Sure.
Rip the linebackers. Any of us who are GMs or head coaches, all our lives we've grown up, at least our age group grew up watching these badass inside linebackers. And you can talk all you want about the nice corners out there, and I'm going retro here, the Lester Hayes of the world, or the Everson Walls, or whoever those guys were, and the linebackers, some of the special ones that we all know back in the day, like Jack Lambert in the 70s, all these people, and Ray Lewis, all these guys. But we all wanted to build our defense. We all want to build our defense around that kick-ass guy inside, right? Whether he's a Mike, back in the day, they were the Mikes, right? Or whether the more athletic guy, it's usually that inside guy who has a presence. I talked to you before about D-line, linebacker, and safety maybe having the leadership presence. If you can get your leader being your inside backer, to me, it just feels conceptually like, there you go. So we can look at all of these stats, right? But in the end, you can bring in a guy who does not lead the team as you want, and you have a major hole in the middle of your defense, and you have to get creative. And it's a hair puller if you can't find that person. You don't really have a safety, and your D-line's taking care of your D-line. You have a hole there from a leadership standpoint and from a play calling standpoint. And if they're not a leader and they're not the most adept at diagnosing, it can be a real bane of your existence as a coach or a GM.
Well, I think especially now where you've seen some, like I think about Kansas City, my favorite team, right? Like I think, just as a fan, like they took a linebacker in the second round, Willie Gay, in 2020. Then they take another guy, Nick Bolton, in 2021, both in the second round. And I think Willie Gay is the better athlete. I think he's got better coverage skills. I think he's got, really good instincts about him. You saw him get a pick six on a really amazing play against Denver just a couple weeks ago. But when it comes down to who wears the green dot, who plays every down, right? There's a politics to that, but what it really is like, who is the leader of the defense? It's Nick Bolton, who's a little slower, right? But he's a little bit surer of a tackler. He's really tough against the run. And I think most importantly, Thomas, and this is something where, this is why you need a holistic approach to player evaluation. Nick Bolton stays healthy. He's never missed a game in his career as a linebacker. So he's the voice of that defense every game. And so maybe he's a 1/10 of a second slower in the 40. Maybe he's not as rangy in coverage, but you'd rather have him like he's calling the shots, right? And a lot of folks that are a lot of folks that I like Willie Gay a lot, but like that defense plays, what is it, 4-1-6 dime, and there's one linebacker on the field, right? And he's going to be the one that wears the green dot. And a lot of these defenses, they want to have a safety wear it, but I don't think that that's necessarily like, I think you need, and maybe this is just me acquiescing to the football guys, but even somebody like as somebody who played, I think you want the green dot guy to be a linebacker because he's going to be kind of in the both levels of the defense. He can relate to both levels of the defense. And, some of that leadership quality. And again, this is something that I just don't know necessarily if we can capture the best in, data yet. That I think you have to rely on people who are on the ground scouting these people.
Well, I'm really confident, by the way. I do believe that SumerSports is going to capture that, and it's going to be groundbreaking. We're going to keep pressing on it, of course, because we know how important it is, and we continue to hear the feedback from any of our NFL buddies about how important it is. So it is important. Let me just say this. I know many of you look at Teddy Bruschi and you see him as a guy on the networks, but Teddy Bruschi epitomized what we're talking about here, right? He was a good linebacker with, good movement and good athleticism, not elite, not very good, not elite. What he did though, he was consistent through and through. He was versatile, and he was a guy that you didn't suffer a lot of injuries. I mean, he had a durability element to him, which you just hit a great point. That durability is one thing when you're not actually out on the field. I get it, but all of a sudden you lose that player that you're counting on from a leadership, from an understanding of the upcoming game. Whatever the game plan is, that guy's off your field. You take a guy who's a step slower, maybe not a step. I always said this with Teddy. You take a guy who's maybe a quarter of a step slower and maybe not as tall or not as, jumping as high and such. You take that guy any day over the guy with all that consistency and all of the knowledge and all of the drive to be the best in the leadership. And he did amazing things for us, obviously, back in New England.
Yeah, and I actually found this in the data. So, like when I was at Pro Football Focus, I did a bunch of betting, model-related things. And, just for the folks that are listening, like one of the hardest parts about sports betting is that like once the information becomes public, once the data source becomes public, like you're not getting an edge. Like there are two ways to get an edge in both team building and also sports betting. And it's A, having better data, right? Collecting better data, having better data at your disposal. And B, it's synthesizing that data better than anybody else, right? And I think we at SumerSports, like we want to capture both. And I think we are uniquely equipped to synthesize the data better than others. But in sports betting, like, once Pro Football Focus grades became available, it was, everybody had them, right? So they're baked into the market. But one thing I did notice when I was looking up, trying to find an edge in NFL markets was if your middle linebacker was out, it was worth a half a point or so to the spread. And that's because the NFL is just such a weak link game, right? And we talk about that. We're going to talk about this with safety because like one of my favorite players in Chiefs history is Tyrann Mathieu. And I think it was because he just did so much. But when you have a linebacker that can rush the passer effectively when he's called on, right? That makes your defensive line better. When you have a linebacker that can stop the run better, that lets you be a little weaker at the line of scrimmage with your tackles and your edge players. If you have a guy that can cover, that makes your life so much easier as a safety because you can fan out a little bit if the guy can get depth in the middle of the field, all that kind of stuff. A middle linebacker can be a force multiplier for a defense if he is very good. And you look at like the San Francisco defense with Fred Warner, like no one's going to, Talihofa Nufanga, he's an amazing safety, but I guarantee you he's better because he plays with Warner. The slot, all the slot guys and everything. Like, I think they're good players for the Niners. I think they're better because they play with a linebacker who can cover up a lot more space than the average guy. And so when that guy is out, you have leadership, but you also have every single player has to play a little left-handed, and that just makes for just a worse defense. And that to me is the point of like Bruschi. That's the point of guys like, when I was growing up in Minnesota, it was like Jack Del Rio was that way. And guys like that were just middle linebackers who could do a ton of different things. They just make a defense better in multiplicative ways that, again, if you can find a guy like that, great. And I think a lot of, right now, when you look at the markets, like they're trying to find that guy. And there's a lot of what I would call like, there's a lot of errors, right? They pay a guy that might not be that good. But if you can find the guy, I do think that they matter quite a bit. And it's the value of the scouts and the analytics to try to separate the guys who are just players at that position versus the guys who are different.
So a little bit of it's a great point just to finish, and I know we'll move on to your next topic. But I've said this time and again, we brought in a guy again. We're talking about Atlanta only because that's my basis here on the linebacker side right now. When we're talking about Sean Weatherspoon, we thought we were going to build around him for many years to come. Unfortunately, he had some injury issues, which bleeds into what we were talking about a little bit earlier. That said, I would say with our entire time there, I'm saying even with Mike Smith and all the way through with Dan Quinn, we never really, we had some good linebackers. Don't get me wrong, but we didn't have a guy that was what we were saying, that we could build around for years to come and build a defense around. That is something that I just can't stress enough for any of the listeners to know, or rising executives and GMs. Like, you can get all the athletic guys, but if they're 2 years, 3 years and out the door, you're lacking something in building that badass defense that every one of the GMs and the head coaches want to build. And the irony of it is, Mike Smith was a really, really good D coordinator, right? And again, 3-time coach of the year, did a hell of a job for us. Dan Quinn, one of the best D coordinators out there in a modern time, I thought. He comes in. Interestingly enough, both of those guys, we ended up focusing more on offense, which is unfortunate because it seems counterintuitive. It's worth another conversation. Did they come in thinking we have the defense taken care of because we know defense in and out, and let's focus on the offense? Because I remember how tough it was to play against really good offenses. Or did they come in just because they were thinking, man, I have to work on an offense that, hopefully we can build around. And again, we'll keep plugging away at a defense a la in the linebacker position. But too often sometimes it's just late when you come to the door or come to the table and you don't have all your pieces in place.
Yeah. For me, that problem of like building around a linebacker is like, I do believe that there are just so few guys, much like quarterback. I think there are just so few guys that actually are difference makers there from would pay a veteran salary to, like Wagner, Warner, Leonard's even one where was struggling to stay healthy, has really hurt that Colts team, which we're going to talk about tonight. And there are guys available in free agency, like CJ Mosley, your guy Ulbrich. Mosley made the Pro Bowl this year after a couple down years. Like, that's a pretty cool accomplishment for New York, even though I think that initial contract they probably regret because he wasn't able to play through a lot of injuries and COVID and stuff like that. It's just a really hard eval. And I think that that's where I get to this point where my null hypothesis is that in our current way of evaluating the position, I don't know if we're good enough at identifying elite talent to really pay elite talent what they're worth. Other positions we're much better at evaluating them, so pay them like such. Like, I have friends in the league who, when I think about like linebacker, like take like you look at the Pro Football Focus grades in Roquan Smith, they like basically say he's a replacement player. And yet, like, you have a team like the Ravens who have made a trade for him as if he's like a 90th percentile linebacker. That kind of inefficiency in the market in terms of evaluating an asset, like, to me, is always going to make, from my team building standpoint, it's going to make me go towards positions that are more efficient and buy variance on guys who, like, if you bought variance on like a Willie Gay or somebody like that, who some metrics like, some metrics don't like, there's traits there, and he could hit that 90th percentile, I might buy into that versus a guy who's going to cost me $20 million, who some systems hate, some systems like. That's going to be always, I'm going to shy away a little bit from that, just because I don't know, if we talk about this, and I don't want to dehumanize somebody, but from an asset perspective, we're not even able to capture the value of that. That's where linebacker is so hard, and why, like, again, having your perspective on it for me is super educational, because I've just tried my hardest to try to understand this position, and I don't think I understand it particularly well. And that's why, again, like, having the holistic approach to understanding the position can, I think, really help teams from making these mistakes.
No, I love that. I love that analogy. And I would say this as well. The idea of one man or one team's food is another team's poison. You have to, you go round and round like that with your head coach as a GM, right? Is this guy really what we think is going to benefit us, but hasn't benefited this other team, or hasn't lived up to his expectations? But then you're kind of in a crossroads, because you also think, and there's a reason they're letting this person go or letting them out in free agency. When we're talking about free agency here, that is a complicated thing, right? Because it looks like, no, we can make him work for this system. And, many times I'd say I question teams doing that, except for when it's Bill Belichick, because some reason he knows exactly what's right for his team. But in the past, it's complicated, because you look good, everyone's excited. No, we're going to make this player live up to his expectations. And then if he fails, you have egg on your face. If it works, of course, it's good, but it's not easy to make those decisions, of course.
Yeah, there's a lot of signal in the fact that Belichick, traded Jamie Collins, let Kyle Van Noy go, et cetera, and paid up for Dante Hightower. Like there's signal there that I think is actually immense. And that's why just having a healthy respect for the marketplace is extremely good, especially when you have, as I've laid out, incomplete data here. So very fun. I like this. And I can't wait because I think we're going to do corners or safeties next. And all the problems I'm talking about with evaluation of linebackers also exist for corners and safeties. So I'm really excited just to get your perspective there. Let's talk briefly, because I know we're almost up against time here. Let's talk briefly about Monday Night Football. I want to put this on the board because this was on our SumerSports Twitter account at SumerSports. By the way, if you are listening, we really thank you. Follow us on YouTube at SumerSports on YouTube, at SumerSports on Twitter. You'll get these. This was made by Parker Fleming, one of our great new data scientists at Sumer. He makes these for college football, but he's also delved into NFL as well. You can find these for all of the primetime games at Sumer Sports on Twitter. We will continue to make these a bigger part of sort of what we're looking at. But basically here you have a win probability estimate. Now, I think the markets have actually moved a little bit towards the Colts since earlier today, but we would make the Chargers a big favorite in this game, going on the road facing the Colts with Nick Foles at quarterback. As you can see, up until the left a little bit, the Chargers have struggled offensively this year, despite having a really good quarterback in Justin Herbert. Basically, when you look at EPA and things like that, not particularly good for them relative to the rest of the league. Even on offense, just a 45% pass success rate, as you can see there. We're going to leave this up here as Thomas and I talk about this game, because I want to talk about the linebackers in this game. And Thomas, you had a linebacker that you want to talk about this game, Drew Tranquill, and I wanted to talk about Kenneth Murray. Let's have you go first here on Drew Tranquill.
Okay, so I mean, here's a good example of a guy who was drafted in the 4th round, right? And he's had some really good years, since he's been with the Chargers. Of course, he's a guy, as we all know, he's not a big guy. He's not one of those take-on guys, although he'll nut up and do whatever he needs to do, which we love. If you ever got a chance to watch that, when he was mic'd up, I mean, his mic'd up, man, that dude is flying high. And I love that about, it doesn't matter what he said. I love the energy. Back to linebackers, carrying the energy. That's part of his role, of course. He's got a really acute mind. He's got the ability to have awareness what's around him. But let's start from evaluating the run and evaluating the pass, and within the pass, the 2 phases quickly. On the run side of things, he's one of those guys that again, very good lateral movement, the ability to step up and continue to play down the line, clear any of the trash that he's working through, of course, get there, square up, and make a play. He's got good eyes. He's really, really good with his eyes, I think, and he has the range to make plays across the field. But if he needs to step up in, he's not afraid to jump up in and take someone on, discard the blocker, and make the play on the run. He is one of those guys that I like watching as a linebacker. Could have probably lost a little bit of weight and played safety as well back in the day, but he's where he needs to be right now. It's fun watching. I think he's going to have a hell of a career. When you're talking about pass with him, the other thing is he's mobile. You watch him drop, again, back to awareness, back to anticipation of breaking on the ball and making plays. He's got the ability to make plays on the ball. He can catch the ball. He's got hand-eye coordination about him. And so he can man up on the tight ends and some backs, of course. It's not always easy in this league. I love watching that. There's versatility in this man. And then get a chance to see him jump up on the line and shoot the gap to pressure the quarterback. To me, he's got all 3 phases where he's playing really good football in my mind. And again, as a 4th rounder, kudos. Very good job by Tom Telesco and the group there.
Yeah, and that to me, I think is like one of the great success stories, right? And sort of what you can look at the position where like I said, it's really hard to evaluate these guys, and so there are positions, as we talked about earlier, like edge and interior, where it's much more easy to evaluate the guys as like, okay, what's their pressure rate? What is their ability to stop the run? We're not perfect there, and we can use tracking data to help us, but like we're better off there. Linebacker, it's not as clear, right? And yet there's one interesting case study here, and I'm going to go to this other guy who was a 1st-round pick by the Chargers. In fact, your guy, Bill Belichick, traded out of the pick back into round 2, got the Chargers to come back into round 1 in 2020 to take Kenneth Murray out of Oklahoma with their 2nd first-round pick. They had Herbert, was the first first-round pick in that draft. And the one interesting thing about Murray was, like, you saw some of what he was going to struggle with at the NFL level in his Oklahoma tape, right? I mean, at Oklahoma, teams throwing in his direction, 102 passes in his direction, 833 yards. That's a pretty big success rate of throwing in his direction. 7 touchdowns, no interceptions. Now, was he like I talk about the fall guy, was he the fall guy in an Oklahoma defense where everything's being funneled to him and he's just trying to make plays and ultimately he's helping out there? That's the exact same thing that's happened when he's gone to Los Angeles, where teams have thrown at him, it's funny, 109 times in 3 years. So the statistics are basically the same, and yet they're getting 863 yards, 5 touchdowns, 1 interception. So what he's struggled with is, when teams have thrown at him, they had success at Oklahoma and they had success in Los Angeles. Is this just a thing where, but at the same time, you're talking about a very good athlete out of Oklahoma, very good athlete, a guy that can move around. In this one instance, what he struggled with in coverage in college was something he struggled with at the pros. And so, he's gotten, his grades have kind of stayed the same, and they kind of stayed the same at Oklahoma. We haven't seen much evidence in the statistics, how flawed they can be, improvement for Murray coming up on year 3, coming up on the 5th-year extension, 5th-year option for him. What did you see anything on his tape when he was at Oklahoma that kind of would rebuff any of this, or is this kind of something that showed up in the eval of him that's also shown up in the statistics?
Yeah, look, I mean, we all saw him as a guy that had, the upside to be, a legit player in this league. And yet there were gaps in his play, just as you had mentioned. There's no question about it. This comes back to really difficult decisions to be made by, a general manager and a head coach, right? Because the general manager, more than likely, this usually seems how it goes. They've been looking at this guy for 14 months. Back to what I said, just everyone grasped that. The head coach and his staff have not been able to do that. They jump on it at the end of the season. So middle of January, if they didn't make the playoffs, early February if they did. And so you have 2 different groups within the building trying to figure it out. And you definitely you have the position coach, like the linebacker coach and the coordinator, who are really pumped up. And remember, I can't stress this enough, coaches believe if they're really good, they have a confidence coming out of their ears that they'll take anyone and make him 2 or 3 points better. So in our grading scale, they'll take him from being a 5, which was adequate. I know this is rudimentary to you from a analytics standpoint, to a 7, which is very good. They really believe they have the ability to move this player. I think as a GM, you oftentimes have to look at that and be realistic, and you have to have a track record of that position coach who's claiming that. And sometimes it's not easy to have that track record. Back in the day, you might have had that coach for 5 and 7 years. In today's world, you may be churning out coaches every 2 or 3 years, and it's a more difficult duty and task to take that on as a GM and to say, okay, my head coach buddy, I get what your position coach is saying, and yet here are 3 guys that he has missed on, that he's said that he will bring them to the level of potential. Potential can kill you in this league for sure. Potential can kill. Yes, you love to have potential with players, but if you're projecting too much of your roster out to potential, you could be a dive bomber.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. The Chargers traded their 2nd and 3rd round selection to move up and get Murray in round 1. So that I think the hard part becomes, right? And look, I don't blame them. When you look at his combine, now this is pre, the COVID combine, you're talking about a 6'2", 240-pound player, with a 4.52 40-yard dash, a 38 vertical jump, almost 11-foot broad jump, and 21 reps in the bench press. Now that's an athlete, right? Like that's the kind of player you want at that position. So I can understand what they're doing. But to your point, Thomas, right? Like when you look at potential, I might take I would take more flyers, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would take more flyers on potential if they are players that I'm taking when I have 10 draft picks, right? If I have a draft of, if I trade a Tyreek Hill, right, and I get 12 draft picks like the Chiefs had, sure, take some guys that have potential because those you have more darts to throw. if you are a team that is moving up in the draft, you have just taken two dart throws essentially, right? You take your second and your third round pick, you move up to a first round pick. So you're not wasting, but you are spending two assets to get one asset. Do you think at all you think that would behoove you to take a more sure thing or a player that's less of a projection with that kind of approach? Or that's kind of my thought, but that's kind of, when you think about trading, to me, that would be more to do if you had, but he is your second first round pick. And to some degree, this is a Chargers team, by the way. You look at our graphic here, courtesy of Parker Fleming at SumerSports. This is a Chargers team that if they win tonight, they make the playoffs, and they make the playoffs in large part because of their first round pick in 2020, Justin Herbert, and not their second one, Kenneth Murray. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. Do you trade multiple assets to go up and get a guy who's high ceiling like Murray? Or do you trade, if you are trading multiple assets, does the guy have to be more of a sure thing?
This is an ongoing forever and ever conversation. We all grew up around these conversations when we were neophytes within buildings, and we all started to develop our own opinion about it. And I think, again, Tom is a really good mind, Telesco. He knows what he's doing there. He's very smart. He obviously came up through Bill Polian. So they're about athletes are big to them. That's why I've always gotten along with Tom and the people that have come through the Colts back in the day, because they had a good idea of movement and athleticism and matching. I like that idea. I was sitting there thinking about what you were saying. If I had two picks anywhere, let's say it wasn't even in the first round. Let's say it was in the third round. We as general managers are oftentimes graded and evaluated by our owners on how you do on your picks. You can never say that, okay, Mr. GM, you've done well in your first round picks, but you've really sucked in the second and third. And you're saying, well, remember, I took that third round because, we had an extra third round, and, we were trying to take a flyer on him. He didn't really work out. So, can you give me a little bit of leeway there? It's not working, right? So we go round and round on that. Ultimately, it is about the betterment of the team. But, you have human elements to this where people want to make sure that they have a good track record so that they can continue to be respected in the building by not only the owner, but, of course, the head coach and the position coaches. It's really important to know that your guy that's in charge of acquisitions has a really sound understanding of how he's going to approach putting the team together. And all that to say, with 32 GMs in the league, Eric, I bet you it could be, 60-40 where people would agree with doing it that way, or say, no way, this is all about proven talent.
Well, and I think that, and to close out here, I think that like a big deal is you want to get, and I was in Minnesota. I talked to Kwesi before the game on Saturday. It was really fun to talk to him. A guy who's had success in year one. You were similar in that you came into Atlanta. Now, Atlanta was worse before you than the Vikings were there, but you had success early. It bought you years so that you could start to build up your drafts could look more like portfolios, and you weren't defined. Now, a lot of people will define you by the Julio Jones trade, for better or worse, but realistic people like me will define you more about the holistic part, like the hits you hit on Grady Jarrett. That's amazing. Most of your first round picks actually ended up pretty damn good. And, you had Campbell and you had Jones and guys like that. You'll look more at the collective. Whereas I understand from the media perspective and from what the owners turn on when they turn on NFL Network, everybody's going to say, well, they messed up this, this first round pick, this high profile pick, and they collect surplus value everywhere else, right? Mm-hmm. That's more how I would look at it. But I do understand from the perspective of, man, if Telesco goes up and gets Murray at 20 and he hits and he becomes the next Bobby Wagner, okay, then you got Herbert. And then you got Murray, and that's a legendary draft, right? Whereas I'm looking at it more from, well, shoot, if Herbert works and you get two average starters in that draft, you're making the playoffs every year, right? Whereas if you whiff on the second pick, it could be, the floor could be lower. And it's just so much more fun. And obviously we'll talk about that when we have other episodes of the show, because I just think that there's so many ways to think about this approach. The drafting and that kind of thing. So, and what I really like about this discussion, what we had about linebacker is there's so much meat left on the bone. I got a message from Pavel Vavichev, one of our great, really intelligent, smart data scientists working on player eval for us. He's like, Eric, I check out this idea I've had about linebackers. So just from listening to the show, so like we're obviously stirring up a great deal of ideas and stuff like that. Where this position, there's so much meat left on the bone to understand it, which is really fun because football's been around for 100 years. Linebackers always been considered one of the most important positions, and yet two people here are grappling over sort of how to evaluate it. So that shows how much opportunity there is for folks like us at SumerSports and everywhere else. So,
by the way, great job by the Parker graphic. I love that. Parker's doing a great job. Obviously, him. Excited about working with him. And Pavel, by the way, just since you brought his name up, we love Pavel. I know he is pissed off about Giants stuff, but that's okay, brother. Hang in there. I know you can get all your happy moments while you're working on all your modeling and such. Keep rolling on that. So we really appreciate you.
Yeah, for sure. And this has been such a fun show to just like sort of talk linebackers and all that good stuff. And yeah, as you said, Parker Fleming, really good data viz. Now, I want to say that my data viz that I brought up here, look, I think it's more steak than sizzle to bring up an analogy, but yet to your point, not the easiest on the eye, but a decent data viz nonetheless. And by the way, that is a paper that myself and Tej Seth have submitted to the Journal of Quantitative Analysis in Sports. It's currently under revision. I hope to get that published in the next few months so that all of you can read about those great linebacker metrics. So hopefully in an ocean of evaluating that position, we can provide people with a bucket and a half of water there. So Thomas, do we have any parting words? I know that things went down a little bit in Denver today. Similar things went down in Indianapolis a few months ago. We get to see the Colts play tonight. We're going to have to wait until next Sunday to see the Broncos. Any parting words?
No, we'll talk about it Wednesday, I hope, when we're talking about Coach Hackett. That's tough. I mean, here's a guy, by the way, that grew up from the day he was born around this sport. It's not an easy sport, of course, and there are other people out there argue that he was brought to the table with a guy like Russell Wilson in the way that he's playing right now. How could he thrive? There's so much banter. I look forward to digging into it a little bit. That's the only thing that caught my eye today as I was doing a little bit of research on that. When I start seeing the wave of names like Harbaugh and Sean Payton, as well as Frank Reich and Dan Quinn, they had Dan fourth or fifth, and I'm thinking, no, we need to move Dan up a little bit closer to that. And look, the reality is Dan Quinn is good friends with George Payton as well. They've always respected each other. They know each other well, and maybe George is saying I should have made that call earlier. Who knows? Believe me, I'm not getting into GM's head on that. It'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. Yeah.
And it's interesting because when we were doing some of our coaching analysis, by the way, that is something that we do at SumerSports. Ejiro Evero, the defensive coordinator for the Broncos, did look really good in that metric. If you look at, I know things fell apart yesterday and giving up 51 points. But most of the season, that Denver defense has been quite good. That is good personnel. Like if somebody like Dan Quinn were to go to Denver, that is not a bare cupboard of defensive players. And you could almost see them have a ton of success with Quinn at the helm, but they were also well coached on the defensive side with their current guy this year. It just got lost in the shuffle because the offense had struggled so much. And so that, that's what makes football a hard game. I mean, offense begats defense and back and forth. So really unfortunate situation there, but one of the storied franchises in the NFL, I'm sure they'll eventually find a successor there that will have success. So very good. Well, so yeah, like Thomas said, Wednesday we'll be live about 7 Eastern. And if you like this, please smash the like button on YouTube. Please subscribe, rate, and review. Some of you have done, yeoman's work there. We'll read some of those, reviews. Next time we will answer listener questions as well. We really do thank all of the loyal people that continue to come and watch us live. Zach, Dean, Mojal, ask questions that are, very, very intelligent, very fun. Thanks for spending your Monday afternoon with us. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 15 of the SumerSports Show.